And we're building up to quite a big milestone, I guess, in Take It From Us's history. I've been hosting mental health radio for 10 years of continuous mental health broadcasting this month. That's more than 500 radio shows, different guests, different issues, but all about psych stuff, which is what Take It From Us specialises in. I'll say more about this milestone on the actual date of October the 17th, a couple of Tuesdays away. In the meantime, we'll be featuring guest interviews where the enormity of guest challenges and the quality of their achievements and recovery have been outstanding. So today we revisit a personal story where our guest describes her upbringing as guerrilla warfare. It's a sometimes harrowing story which some might find hard to believe could happen here in God's own country. So let's revisit the personal life experience of Liz. We've withheld her surname. As she grows up and how it impacted her mental and emotional health. What was your life like growing up as a young girl?
Thank you for having me. I appreciate you having me on. Like I summated in the last couple of episodes, I grew up in 2 decades of domestic violence. So basically I was terrified of my parents for 2 decades, and I believed that they would kill me based on their behaviour, really.
I think you described that it was like growing up in the trenches. Is that a fair description?
Yes, that is a fair description. And so hence the post-traumatic stress disorder, the association with being a soldier in a war zone. And it was effectively a war zone for the 2 decades I was part of it. My parents were married for 22 decades, so it really was a 22 years of, of war zone, really. And my sisters and I were sort of born into that. So unlike a soldier that has a civilian life before you go to war, we didn't have any recollection of a life before that.
So it started right from year dot, really.
As far as I can recall, really, I'm the oldest, so I don't remember a period before it.
And you had how many other sisters? How many sisters?
I've got 2 younger sisters, one that is 2.5 years younger than me, and another sister who's much younger, who's 10 years younger than me. So the sister who's closer in age to me, we had a much more similar experience, but by the time my youngest sister came along, the violence was still there, but it was manifesting in a different way.
Yeah, how did that violence manifest itself? I mean, I don't know whether you're comfortable to talk about that, but we can talk generally about domestic violence without really knowing what the detail is.
The details are pretty straightforward. It was very much a sort of once were warriors childhood. Of course, some things were different, but the level of constant fear and the threat of violence was just an absolute constant, really. My sister, who's closer in age to me, we were beaten by my father for the first decade of our lives, roughly, for myself anyway, and then it shifted once my younger sister came along, for a variety of reasons, really, but the level of violence and the constant fear was still the same, really. And I guess, I'd sort of talk about, I'm pretty certain that I was beaten before I went to school, so, that I would have weighed, maybe 15 kilos at the time, and my father was an average-sized man, so he weighed about 85, roughly. So that's the force of 6 grown men if they came into your studio right now. And, the anger involved in it, the level of rage. So if you could imagine being held captive by 6 rageful men for 5 years, that's pretty much, the first 5 years of my life. And there wasn't. I was at home with my parents for those years. There wasn't a preschool or a kindergarten, or my parents certainly never looked into it.
So you had no relief from it. By I guess you're suggesting that if there was a childcare or a preschool, you would have had some relief from the violence.
Sort of, but the flip side of that was well, maybe, but of course I was always frightened anyway. So because they were my parents, I saw the whole world through them. I just imagined that the rest of the world would treat me the same the way they were, because that was my experience, really. I didn't have any other experience. So when I went to school, I was born with red hair, quite bright red hair, and when I went to school it went white. And that was the shock of going out into the world. And now all of a sudden there wasn't just two people who might kill me, there was a whole world of people out there.
That was the effect of this, that you didn't trust anybody out in the world as a result of what was happening at home.
No, because they're the two people that you learn, most things about the world in those first 5 years, really. For me, anyway, there weren't any other, major adult. There was one, but it was a really minor contribution. And I don't, I could blame my parents, or I could get into that, but really it was a whole community thing. My parents lived in a neighbourhood, there were teachers, there were doctors, there was extended family, so there were people who, if they didn't know, they definitely heard or saw, or, it was a community issue, really.
How did your parents behave with other people, like you're talking about the community? How did they behave in the community? Did they express anger or frustration, or were they model community members?
No, my father was definitely a very angry person, so most people avoided him, to the point that no one came to our house. And my mother was just very withdrawn and quiet. She was, able to sort of, be polite and get along with people, but she was very withdrawn and very quiet. And I was effectively the same as a child going to school, withdrawn and quiet. But of course in a school setting, that's considered quite good.
Yeah. Your mother's withdrawal and quietness and that sort of thing, do you think that she also was on the receiving end of violence?
To my knowledge, not until a bit later, but of course as a child you're not privy to everything. But she was definitely very frightened for a very long time, really. And it's this, I've had experiences of being terrified of a partner, in my adult life, and being terrified of an intimate relationship, is really difficult, because you're lying next to this person that night who you think might potentially kill you. That is, does it get any more terrifying than that, really? So
they're the sort of repercussions of 20 years of growing up in violence. Just before we sort of get on onto that, as I get older, I think quite a lot about, the role model of my parents. And, they are our guides and our sort of ambassadors and champions and that sort of thing, aren't they? But in your case, that was all completely stuffed up.
Yes, well, yeah, no, they were engaged in their 20-year war. And I was a very intelligent child, and in the last 2 years of high school, I got straight A's, and I remember I wasn't aware that I'd done that until I got my last sort of report card, and another school child had pointed it out to me. And so I went home with this and was going to show my mother, and she was too busy involved in the war zone, really, with my father. So basically you don't get any parental support at all, much.
Just to clarify there, it took a friend to point out that you had got straight A's in the exam.
Yes.
Normally that's one of the first things after an examination that we look at. Why did you ignore that?
Because I wasn't living in my body. I was just completely dissociated until I was about 27. I just wasn't present, really. And I got such good grades because I was a workaholic, and that's what I used to cope with what was going on, really. I could sit in my bedroom and do my schoolwork, and that meant I was doing something constructive and industrious, and I was left alone. And so that was my way of kind of removing myself as much as I could, even though physically I was still there and I could still hear what was going on.
Achieving straight A's in the violence that you were growing up in, I mean, that makes that a super achievement, doesn't it? Is that the way you look at it?
Well, it seems to, but in actual fact, if I was to do it now as myself, I probably wouldn't be a straight-A student. I'd probably be more sporty and a bit more well-rounded than I really was. And yeah, of course, I came out in the top 5% of my year when I left high school, so I could have gone into medicine. But I couldn't actually have a conversation with anybody because I was so terrified all the time. So what was the point, really?
Yeah.
And the irony of that isn't lost on me, and I guess that's why I draw attention to it, because there is a stereotypical idea that, children who come from domestic violence situations, don't do well at school, that they, but it's not true. It's always a complex mix when you're a human being.
So much, it sounds as though so much was robbed from you in this 20 years. Clearly you were somebody who was very bright, regarded doing well as being very important, and yet, as you say, there was very limited ability to relate to anyone, which must have isolated you terribly further, in fact.
Well, yeah, absolutely, yeah, and it did. But I couldn't maintain relationships with people because, based on my first experience of my parents' relationship to myself. And it wasn't like all of what I'm most of all of what I'm telling you now, I've only really learnt to articulate through years of psychotherapy. When I was living in it, and up until the age of, probably 41, I wouldn't have been able to articulate it as well. Definitely when I was living in it, I had very limited capacity to practically say anything about what was going on for me. Because I learnt in psychotherapy, when I was 32, I learnt that for my whole life I had believed that I was not a human being, and that was up to the age of 32. It's not like I believed I was better than a person. I believed I was way less. I just believed I was the most revolting thing on the planet. And that's for me, that happened because I was treated inhumanely as a child for a very long time. And as a result, I believed I was inhuman.
Well, what other repercussion? I mean, that's a tragic and traumatic repercussion in itself, but what other repercussions were there in terms of, say, the potential to work or the potential to have intimate relationships or the potential to have friends?
Yeah, well, absolutely. Yeah, no, that just all went down the drain, effectively. And I left high school and it looked on paper that I had truckloads of potential. But the reality was that, I just couldn't stick with anything. I would just be terrified all the time. And I didn't really know that there was anything wrong with me. And I didn't know what was wrong with me, really. So up until the age of 27, I just sort of muddled along, really. I worked a bit, but not much. I went to art school, which was an environment where my eccentric behaviour was kind of just seen as eccentric.
You fitted in with all the other eccentrics.
Well, not really. I didn't really communicate with anybody. But I passed, I guess. And so, not meaning, like I did very well academically, but I passed as being, my behaviour was sort of, kind of acceptable. But to my thinking now, alarm bells were ringing all over the place if I see somebody that was like myself, because I basically couldn't really communicate with anybody. And I lived with my mother up until I was about 30. And I started psychotherapy when I was 27.
What about the desire to reach out to people and have friends? And was that just too frightening a prospect?
Yeah, well, absolutely. I wanted everything that everybody else had, really. I could see it, sort of, right from attending school, from going to school. I could see that other people had these things, but I had no idea how you got there, really. And I remember a friend trying to show me how to play chess, and she kind of showed me what all the little characters did, but she didn't show me how to win. And that effectively was kind of my life, really.
It can be a hard game. It can be a hard game to win chess.
Well, yeah, but I didn't even have any idea what you had to do to get there. I knew what the little characters did, whatever they're called, how they moved around.
The pieces.
The pieces, yeah, how they moved around, but I didn't know the alignment that you needed to create, some chance of winning. So I could see people having friends and relationships and partners, but I just didn't know how you got that.
One step, I guess a first step might be to ask some questions. Was that, did you feel just totally fearful of even asking questions of somebody?
You mean like asking, how do you be friends?
How do you be friends, or how do you win at chess, or how do you...
Yeah, I guess I was too afraid. I guess to use the chess example, I would have been so immensely gratified that anybody was spending 2 seconds with me, that this person was showing me how to do this. I would have been so grateful that she was spending 10 minutes, and that would have been the main thing. I wouldn't have got past that. Yeah. I would have been amazed that somebody was spending 10 minutes with me to show me something.
And perhaps were you a little bit over the top about that generosity from that person, and maybe that frightened them away?
I don't know. I was 10 years old. I don't know. No, I just... my parents didn't encourage us to be social at all. In fact, they pretty much did the opposite. They were quite happy with us not having relationships because that was difficult for them, really. And I remember my mother with parent-teacher interviews. She was hugely relieved when she didn't have to go to them anymore because it highlighted their functioning in the world, which, just wasn't really. So they didn't want to draw attention to that, and we did that by going out into the world and bringing the world back home in that way. And they didn't want to draw attention to it.
Do you think the fact that they didn't function very well, sort of they wanted to impose that on you so that they didn't get shown up or get jealous or whatever the theory might have been?
I don't think it was a deliberate thing. I think there was a lot of shame, especially for my mother, involved in everything about our lives. So it was never deliberate. It was a survival. Everything in that time period was a survival mechanism. Everything for all of us. We are in the trenches, all 5 of us. So it's all just a survival thing. And it's all it's a cultural thing, and it's a generational thing as well. My mother was married in the 60s. And she didn't come from an environment that was sort of open-minded to the idea of leaving a violent relationship.
Right.
So there was a lot of shame, and even still, making the wrong choice when you married the wrong person, really. So that I can't really speak for my mother, but that's just my assumption of that time period and her generation and her growing up. But of course, there was people that did. I know she tried at least once, I can remember. But I have since learnt that on average, a person tries 10 times to leave a relationship like that. That's the average, really. So some people try more before they succeed, and some people try less. But 10 times is the average.
Yeah. Well, it sounds as though she wasn't equipped to survive in the real world either, in the way that you describe.
You're with Take It From Us on 104.6 Planet FM. Liz,
one of my beliefs is that fear is one of the most eroding things to our mental health. When I get fearful, I know that my mental health is likely to go down the gurgler. How have you managed this fright and fear of, probably 30 years to come out in recovery?
I guess for a long time I didn't really manage it when I was, very sick. And Yeah, I guess as a child you developed some coping strategies just based on the limited resources that were available to me. So being a workaholic, I guess, would have been the predominant thing. Both my parents were, in their own ways, workaholics. So I sort of picked up on that and basically for a long time just kept working, kept my head down, really. And yeah, when I was 27, I guess it all sort of came to a head a bit, where I realised that if I had a problem in my life, then I would go and work, and it didn't really solve the problem. Really, it just was a way of avoiding things.
Well, wasn't there a risk of burnout there? I mean, us workaholics eventually burn out.
No, I guess because the fear was greater than the constant level of terror that I lived in was the predominant thing, really. Everything else just fell beside the wayside. Yeah, maybe if I'd crashed and burned, but I didn't. And I guess, up until I was 27, it's pretty physically robust. So just kept going and going and going. So it looks like it sort of looks like I'm a high achiever because I'm working. But in actual fact, I'm not doing anything else at all, really, whatsoever.
Okay, well, let's go back to this interview with Liz, revelations of her upbringing and life with Liz, and the impact of violence and abuse on her mental health and really her emotional and adult life. With guest Liz Manson, who's been telling us about her upbringing, a horrific upbringing. Liz, when did you actually enter the sort of mainstream public mental health services?
I would have been 30 when I walked into EPS.
EPS being?
Emergency psychiatric services, yes.
Whereabouts was that?
That was in Dunedin.
Right, so what was happening for you to just walk into an emergency psychiatric service?
By then I'd been seeing a psychotherapist for about 3 or 4 years, and so once I started psychotherapy, everything of all those years that I hadn't felt just came rushing back at 100 miles an hour. So I was like, it was basically just a life of post-traumatic stress disorder, really. I was hallucinating a lot. I was really basically just struggling all the time to remain in touch with reality, with enough reality, really. And I walked into EPS because I'd heard that somebody ran a group for people who had anxiety and depression, which was all that I knew I had at the time. Or I just thought I had anxiety, really.
But that, not even that had been officially diagnosed.
No. And I walked into EPS and I could tell, there was some nurses around, and I could tell by the way they were looking at me that they thought there was something wrong with me. And that was kind of weird, but you get used to that after a while. And then I saw a nurse, and I was asking her about this group and telling her about what was happening in my life, and she asked me if I wanted to be assessed by a psychiatrist.
I mean, was it natural for people to just walk in off the streets and do what you did?
I don't know. I'm not a psychiatric nurse. I've got no idea. That was my first contact. I was on my way to pick up a job interview, and I saw the sign that said psychiatric services, and I thought they might know something about this group that somebody had mentioned. So right. I walked in and asked them over the counter, and they all looked at me like I'd landed from Mars.
What was the next thing that happened then?
I saw a psychiatric nurse in a little room, and she asked me some questions. I can't remember exactly, but I do remember her asking me if I thought I should be assessed, and I didn't know what she was talking about.
So what happened then?
Well, she made a referral. I wasn't assessed. I went home and tried to survive, and she made a referral through to outpatient group therapy program, which the hospital was running at the time.
But it sounded as though you were in a state of disarray, mental health disarray.
Oh yeah, I was incredibly sick, very, very sick. Yeah.
Would you say you were at crisis?
Oh, it's beyond. I've been in crisis for a long time.
Right.
It's somewhere beyond that point.
Yeah.
But how did you survive that those crisis circumstances. I mean, most of us, when we get into crisis, or me anyway, I need help immediately, and that might be in the form of the crisis team or the community mental health centre, a psychiatrist, or a hospital.
Well, I guess, again, I hadn't had a period of not living in crisis. My whole life had been crisis. And I just basically, like, my life was very small. I was working in a very limited capacity. Well, then my job had just finished. And I didn't have any relationships much. My life was really tiny. So in that way, I could kind of manage it, but basically I kept my head down. And at that stage I'd lost quite a lot of weight. But of course they didn't know that because they'd never seen me before.
So you went on to get further help, if that's the right word, from the mental health system, but I understand that help wasn't particularly useful.
Well, I did get referred to the outpatient group therapy program, and that was 18 months of very good assistance, and I wouldn't have survived if I hadn't have had that. I will always be eternally grateful for that because, it made a really big difference in my life.
So you were working with other people, and that's often a great insight. The sharing that we get from other people illuminates us, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah, well, I'd been alone with this for 30 years, and it was such a relief to hear somebody else talking about having the same experience and the same struggle because, it's not something I could talk about in my life. I'd never heard anybody articulate it before, really, and I learnt a lot of, what I'm able to do now in that setting, really. And the great thing about the group setting was that, I'd been alone with a psychotherapist once a week for 3 years, but here she was. She just economically, socially, culturally, she was miles away from me. And I was paying money for it, which was effectively very difficult. So it was really hard to create a relationship in that situation. And
if I could just, sorry to interrupt,
sure.
Liz, but did she recognise the crisis that you were in and refer you to somebody who could have diagnosed you so that you at least had a starting point to know what you were dealing with?
No, she didn't.
At no point did she identify your level of crisis?
No, not at all.
So how did you feel about that?
Oh, well, yeah, once I got to outpatient groups and started working out how she'd let me down, I was not very happy about that. But I continued seeing her because, because I'm so sick at the time, I just don't have the resources to change too much, really. Basically, I learnt a lot about myself in the group process, just hearing other people's stories who were further along from me, who were weller, so I could kind of see where I might want to be, and then later on, I could hear other people were in the same place that I'd been in a while ago, and so I was able to sort of offer, something for them. Well, look, mate, I was there, right. And now I'm a little better now, and so that was just a huge, that just made a big difference to me, and I guess, it had been 30 years of being alone with a living nightmare.
So was 18 months of that therapy enough, do you think?
No, it wasn't. And I say it was 18 months because after 18 months, after 18 months, my mother is diagnosed with cancer and dies. And so at that point, I wasn't able to do any more group work because my mother was terminally ill and died. So my life was in another kind of crisis, right, which was completely unforeseen. It was just like, okay, I've been standing on the highway for years trying not to get run over by trucks, and then this aeroplane comes out of the air and lands on me. It was another crisis that I just didn't see coming.
But did that crisis, your mother's crisis, did that require you to step in and manage the family affairs and interrupt your own life again?
What there was of it, yes, because I was the sort of primary sort of person there, to organise what was happening for her, and there's a lot involved in that, really. Yeah, so no, it did. And I stayed in outpatient groups all during that time, which was a mistake. So I say, to me, my work there was only 18 months, but I actually stayed longer than that. But once my mother was diagnosed with cancer, I couldn't do any work on myself because I was living my actual life. Once I left group, my life was a crisis. And so I was spending 20 hours a week with people who wanted to kill themselves, and of course they're working on it. And then I would go out into the world, and the one person that I loved was dying. And that was my life for 6 months while she died, and then...
So those circumstances caused your life to be taken over again by family that had treated you very badly for 20-odd years. It's somewhat ironic.
Well, there's plenty of irony, like I said. My whole life is very ironic, really, yeah.